TYTD.
Generally speaking, I'm not a channel that likes to play to the gallery. Oh, don't get me wrong, from time to time I'll pick an occasional cult classic like Silent Night, Deadly Night 2 or Nookie. But as a rule, I kinda like to leave films like The Room or Birdemic to other folks. I kinda feel like they've been mined to death in this format, and for me to put my 10 pence in would basically just add to an already fairly sizable spectrum of op-eds varying in quality and ability that really doesn't need to grow any further. That, and I figure you guys probably want to learn more about the deep cuts than ones everybody's already talked about, and as an aside, if you do want to know my exact thoughts on the more mainstream bad movies I don't cover here, I very likely have already covered them over on Letterboxd. #sneaky plug. But over the new year, I saw a film that had been on my bad movie hit list for a number of years now that I thought I'd finally crack the seal on after multiple recommendations and referrals. And that film is 2004's Suburban Sasquatch. And while this one has been talked about by everyone and their mother's brother's cat's dog's boyfriend, I personally felt that there was a little bit more going on here than would usually appear in movies that get the so bad it's good moniker. So much so that I eventually relented and felt I had to talk about it here. The film is technically SOV, really more shot on mini-DV, but hey, who's splitting hairs? I personally have quite the fondness for the format, as after learning the rough tricks of the trade shooting and splicing on VHS, mini-DV was the format that I really cut my teeth on. It was the format that let me really experiment more and learn how to edit on NLE software. It's kind of a nice middle ground in my opinion between the fuzzy low-res world of VHS and the slightly pixelated compressed world of early HD video. Significantly cleaner than VHS, less compressed than early digital video, but not quite as sharp as early 720p cameras. But I digress. I like the look of mini-DV, and Suburban Sasquatch is likely the most mini-DV-ist mini-DV shot movie you've ever seen. If you ever wanted to know the answer to the question, what would a Godfrey Ho directed Bigfoot movie look like? Well, you'll more or less find your answer here, though I do wish there were more ninjas honestly. As this basically feels like 3 different Bigfoot movies have all been supercut together with about 5 minutes of crossover footage shot to help smooth the splices. If I didn't know for a fact that this was shot as one whole movie, I'd have been certain that there were 3 separate ones. So plot 1 follows Rick. This would be considered our main plot line. Rick is a reporter working for a small local newspaper who dreams of leaving his days covering Pee-wee football behind to become a big city writer. As such, Rick regularly bothers his boss for permission to go and explore mysterious and unusual stories, chasing leads that quite often lead to nowhere. And his boss has pretty much had enough of it and wants him back on the Pee-wee leagues. Rick's current lead is a bit of a weird one. A string of mysterious and unexplained deaths are happening in the suburbs and around the surrounding woodland. You may think a serial killer, but these bodies are often torn limb from limb and usually partly eaten. Rick's been trying to get answers, but this is where the mystery gets interesting. Because the cops close every single crime scene to the press immediately on landing and are essentially gagging the story, even refusing to acknowledge that people are getting murdered. Luckily, Rick has a cop friend on the inside, who buzzes him whenever a body is reported, giving Rick maybe just a few minutes ahead of the cops to get there and investigate before he gets escorted off the premises. Running at a wit's end and not sure where to turn, Rick visits his grandma, who gives him the courage to begin exploring things a bit further. And in doing so, he's met with a revelation. There are tons of locals being murdered, and it's no man killing them. It's a Sasquatch. While the above is going on, we also have, running in tandem, plot 2, which follows John. John is, I assume, the chief of police for this local suburban area and has a somewhat troubled past. John had a wife called Celia, and prior to this film's events, the pair had just bought their first house and settled in. However, disaster would strike suddenly when a Sasquatch randomly teleported into their backyard, attacked and heavily injured John before taking Celia and teleporting out of there. John never managed to recover from the loss of Celia, and after selling the house and relocating to this part of town, he vowed that if a Sasquatch ever turned up in his neck of the woods again, that he'd be the man to put it down. And wouldn't you know it, not long after taking up the new job in town, a Sasquatch turns up and starts wrecking up the place. So he does what he's been planning to do for a while. He builds up a profile of the Sasquatch, with the ultimate aim being to lure him out into the open and gun him down between him and his friends. But some pesky reporter named Rick keeps getting onto the scene more or less as soon as John does, and he doesn't want word of a killer Sasquatch getting out because A, he doesn't want to panic the community about teleporting killer beasties, and B, because there's a high chance some random redneck will get to kill the Squatch before he can, and he's literally only living for that revenge right now. Then finally we have plot 3, which introduces us to Talia, a young woman currently undergoing training with a spiritually driven group that may be some kind of Native American avatar, but I don't believe they expressly say they're Native Americans. Her grandfather's been training her in the way of the tribe before gifting her a spirit animal in the form of a mighty Birdemic-style eagle that can sense when great evil is on the way. Talia completes her training and is then sent to begin the final trial, which is eventually revealed to be to kill a Sasquatch. You see, in this world, Sasquatch are a bit of a mythic menace to anyone who happens to come by them. They feed on soul energy, which here means the flesh and blood of the living. By absorbing soul energy, they give themselves several mystical powers, including regenerative health and teleportation. However, the Sasquatch Talia's been given to fight is a bit different from the others. Other Sasquatch are normally passive creatures who only attack in defense or as a means of survival. The Sasquatch she's been given, however, is just slaughtering anything it lays its eyes on, and that's concerning because it's absorbing more soul energy than it was ever intended to absorb. Talia and the tribe seem to think this stems from a curse placed on the Sasquatch's parents, but the concern is that if this Squatch is allowed to keep consuming soul energy at the rate that it is, it could very well find itself immortal, and an immortal problem to anyone who happens to be standing in its way. Talia is armed with magical dual-tipped arrows that subdue the creature. Her tribe were peacekeepers and guardians, and with normal Sasquatch, that means guiding randomly spawned Squatches to safe areas, or as a last resort killing them if they refuse to cooperate. And on completing her trial, she'll become a fully fledged guardian, travelling the world removing or rehoming Sasquatch and other creatures for the safety of humankind. Unfortunately, this Sasquatch proves to be more than a handful for Talia, and when some bumbling reporter called Rick begins turning up randomly where the Sasquatch is teleporting in, she may find herself eventually having to deal with not just an immortal Bigfoot on her hands, but a question of faith to boot. All of these plot points eventually congregate with varying degrees of success in a third act finale that sees cops mob Sasquatch, lightning powers, and an old Christian lady singing songs of faith. In a... well, it's a finale, I guess. Will John find retribution? Will Rick bite the Big Apple? And what happened to Talia's grandfather whilst all this was going on? Well, all this and more will be answered if you check out Suburban Sasquatch. And when I say that I wasn't at all prepared for the opening 10 minutes of this movie, I am not using hyperbole. Putting this disc in, I was expecting a low, no-budget, no-effort 90 or so minute romp with rubbish costumes padded up the wazoo. But instead, and the reason I chose to cover this film in the end, I actually found what I believe to be a wonderfully self-aware film that is actually trying to do something at least a bit interesting and grand on as little money as possible. Now, I am far from an advocate of the intentionally awful movie subgenre. You know, the kind where companies like Sterling Entertainment or the many, many clone companies of The Asylum, or even more recent Troma offerings, will basically give a filmmaker who isn't interested in a project 2p and tell them to go and make a 70 to 90 minute movie with a title Big-Titted Angry Hornets of the Dead 7, and the filmmaker will realise this is a stupid movie with a viewership of about 10 people, and because of that, they basically won't even try to make something worth actually watching. So instead they'll cut corners, take on most of the work themselves because it saves money, and lean into this being a bad movie as part of the production choice, resulting in a crazy film that's usually 65 minutes of walking around married up to 10 minutes of stock footage. I can't stand movies like that. My attitude is that if a filmmaker can't be asked to at least try to make something with heart, or even a basic point, then why should I be asked to tune in? Suburban Sasquatch, however, is a bit different. A lot of people online have seemingly watched this and just written it off as a bad movie made by incompetent people. And I actually think I'd beg to differ. The film's writer and director, Dave Wascavage, seems to specialise in challenging himself to make movies on as little money as possible, with the average production budget of most of his films being somewhere in the region of around $100. Equally, given the year this film came out lines up nicely with the rise of Adult Swim and that particular strain of low no-budget DIY alternative comedy, with shows such as Aqua Teen Hunger Force, Space Ghost Coast to Coast, Home Movies and Tom Goes to the Mayor, I don't think that Suburban Sasquatch was just some inept guy with a camera clumsily falling into a movie. Rather, I think Suburban Sasquatch is an actually quite well made, for the budget, comedy horror film that's very self-aware of what it is and what it's trying to be, and is a film that's actually embracing that very thrown together Adult Swim vibe of the early and mid-2000s. The script is probably the strongest indicator of this. It's a plot about an inept, schlubby reporter chasing a magical teleporting immortal Sasquatch with a quasi-Native American woman hot on his heels in a will they won't they that reeks of they will within 20 seconds of them being introduced to each other. We have cops in ill-fitting Party City uniforms rolling around on the floor and screaming incoherently. We have sly fourth wall breaks and tongue-in-cheek self-aware dialogue with lines like, "Monsters aren't real, just like the boogeyman or your father. Go out and play." Not to mention that while I have no doubt that the CGI in this thing has somewhat been played up for comedy effect, you've got to imagine that even doing this kind of CG in 2004 required some kind of technical skill to be able to achieve it, let alone as a one-man band. No, I'm a firm believer that Dave Wascavage is a relatively competent filmmaker whose art lies in low, no-budget comedy, horror and science fiction cinema, and more intentionally around the art of incompetence. There's too many well-timed mistakes, too many nods and winks to the camera in terms of the dialogue, character tone and delivery. There's too many tells here that suggest that this is largely intentional, or rather, to get this much hilariously wrong by accident would border on the same odds as winning the lottery a few times in a row. Within the script itself, we have 3 acts, which are relatively cleanly paced out, though the flip-flopping nature between the 3 different plot lines does make it a little difficult to see where the transition lines are. The pacing is somehow simultaneously breakneck, with at least 2 or 3 different things happening in any given 10-minute window in this film, whilst also getting weirdly bogged down in repetition, with the Sasquatch basically breaking into the film every 7 to 10 minutes to just randomly kill someone and then disappear. You may think that repetitious padding would be annoying. You'd be wrong, because what happens here is what I fondly refer to as the Stuart Lee effect, where they repeat a bit so many times that it stops being funny, then somehow becomes even funnier, then becomes annoying, then becomes the funniest thing you've ever seen in your life. Tonally, most people would say this was just a bad horror movie, but I feel the intentional incompetency and knowing nudges to the audience give this just the right amount of comedic edge to really give it a big boost. And it's consistent in that tone all the way up to the last 15 minutes or so, where the film kind of hits one of its very few speed bump issues for me really. It realises it has to end, somehow. And as a result, it slows down and gets a bit bogged down in trying to front load a lot of thoughts and feelings into a very narrow window of time to get the characters into the right place for the finale, which itself is a bit underwhelming. And then the film just kind of stops, because it actually kind of overdid it on the front-loading feelings, meaning it had nothing else really to explore much beyond that final encounter. Everything up to this point was goofy fun, but the finale pumps the brakes and it kinda lost me a little as a result. Not to mention that it leaves so many plot points still on the table without an attempt to even begin to resolve them. The characters are all pretty one note. They're the kind of characters where it feels like they didn't exist in any capacity before the opening scene and will forever vanish into the ether on the credits roll. Whereas most films try and build a world and want you to believe that the story and adventure will go on, this film is more interested in just making characters that have an expiry date that would trump most meat counters. These are all mono characters with mono thoughts and feelings who seemingly just say whatever comes into their heads no matter how dumb or blunt, but in a way that's kind of charming for this film. Its sincerity lies in just how simple the plot is and how uncomplicated these characters' lives are. They're the cinematic equivalent of a guy pulling on a push door for 90 minutes. And I kind of have to respect that level of dedication to maintaining a character's struggle in the face of total non-adversity. And, as mentioned, the dialogue is pretty incredible, honestly. A heady mixture of lines that read like they were written by a speaking clock or AI before its time, combined with just the odd line or moment that feels like the filmmaker is looking directly at the viewer and saying, "I know exactly what I'm making and I hope you're enjoying this journey as much as I am." And, in many ways, I kinda love that. It's goofy and strange, but does have an undercurrent that's keen to let the audience know that this is a bit. I do feel, however, that given the current state of media literacy in this country, that bit may have fallen on deaf ears. Not that I'm saying that Dave is some kind of 4D chess master, but he clearly enjoys the art of organised chaos, which I have a lot of respect for. Oh, and also because I couldn't really fit it in anywhere, there seems to be a fairly decent chunk of this film running religious undertones throughout. Like, they never overtly go full on God's not dead here, but they make Rick's grandma a hardcore Christian who teaches Rick to follow God's plan, and he does, and things kind of work out as a result. The end credits is Rick's grandma singing about unwavering faith in the Lord. The third act has a lot of discussion about false faiths, atheism, and God. Like, it's nothing overt, this isn't a religious movie, particularly at least, but they just weirdly keep running themes of faith and the Christian God in the background of this weird Sasquatch movie for some reason. And I don't know why. As mentioned, the script was written and directed by Dave Wascavage. He has 7 writing and directing credits, he's written everything he's directed, and as mentioned, he's a DIY filmmaker, often shooting on low, no budget with credits including Tartarus and Zombies by Design. At the time of recording, his last credit was in 2013, which means we're probably long overdue another entry. On the direction front, Rough and Ready is pretty much the flavour of the day here, and another aspect to this that makes me think that this was by design rather than just a guy not knowing what he was doing. See, most incompetent filmmakers will just set the camera up on a tripod in the vague direction of whatever they're trying to film. They won't really check it's properly focused, and they won't consider things like B-roll or CGI placement or how it'll cut with other footage to make up a sequence. They shoot what they think they need as a minimum, or shoot a load of random stuff and hope it just comes together in the final edit. Here, Dave's working largely solo, but it's clearly planned. There's clearly been some degree of storyboarding, with a rough and ready, up-close and personal, handheld aspect largely being the aesthetic choice. I feel that a lot of people these days will see something that isn't polished to within an inch of its life, utilising stabilisation and dollies and extensive B-roll, and they'll just automatically assume that it's badly made. But I don't think that that's the case here. I think it's purposefully designed to have that slightly anarchic razz to it. I'm absolutely not saying that this film doesn't have some moments where directionally it's a flop, but what I will say is that Dave here seems to be experimenting from the position of his comfort zone, with I would say about 70% of the film being a style and technique that he's comfortable filming in, and maybe about 20 to 25% being attempts at new ways of working with mixed results coming forward. What I can say from my own perspective is I really like the direction of this piece. It reminded me a bit of the kind of stuff that would randomly play on TVs in the background of episodes of Aqua Teen Hunger Force or SpongeBob SquarePants. I appreciate the unique aesthetic of the piece and an almost defiance against the more traditional ways of directing. I think it only enhances the end product further. Direction of the cast, however, is something I'm a bit less fond of if I'm being completely honest. Usually when a film is in pre-production, a tone and style is kind of pre-agreed, and a part of that process is deciding what tone and level of animation the cast should be at. Standardising the vibe of the cast is kind of essential, because you don't want one guy doing his best Gene Wilder in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, another doing her best Jennifer Connelly in Requiem for a Dream, and another guy doing Charles Bronson a la Death Wish. It's okay to maybe have one cast member break rank and be a bit louder, more eccentric or more aggressive, if that character is playing against the vibe of the rest of the cast as a contrast. But you don't want all your actors playing totally different vibes, and unfortunately that seems to be the case here. The cast seem to fall into one of 3 types: overtly aggressive and animate, a balloon with a face drawn on it, and I'm crying and peeing my pants. And these characters are locked into one of those 3 tropes for the entire movie, and it's very jarring. Some of the characters can't seem to break out of the type they've decided to go for, and at least 3 of the cast can't remember a single line of the script, and seemingly had to have their scripts either worked into the set so they could read lines off camera, or they were seemingly reading the lines for the first time there and then, delivering it with the confidence of a bomb disposal officer on their first day in the job, when they've only attended kukri classes. This isn't helped either by the fact with multiple scenes, the actors talking to each other aren't even in the same room as each other, with one guy's take shot on one day and the responses filmed on another. It means all the conversations here feel odd and weirdly delivered because the actor doesn't know the tone the other cast member's going for, and the director seemingly hasn't quite figured that out either, which can lead to a quite surreal but also ultimately kind of dull experience. That being said, set use is half decent, prop use equally so. I get the feeling if the scenes involved action or fight choreography, which in and of itself is minimalist due to the limitations of the Sasquatch costume, then detail was drawn up to make sure those scenes worked as well as they could. But if it was just a scene of a cast member sharing information or progressing the plot, the director seemingly just told them the scenario on location and then hit record. As for the Cine, organised chaos once again is the soup of the day. From a top-down approach, I do believe these scenes and sequences were 90% planned out and detailed. I think the experimentation is hit and miss, more miss than hit if I'm being honest. B-roll gets a decent outing, which is rare and welcome in a film like this. Sequence structuring is very much run and gun vibes, especially for the fight sequences. But again, I believe Rough and Ready is Dave's actual aesthetic as a creator, rather than it being a necessity forged by not knowing what he's doing. And, as such, I think he handles this really quite well. The chaos during the fight scenes translates well to the screen, the low-budget nature adds a distinctly DIY feel. Compositionally, things range from the bizarre to the awful to the genuinely quite intriguing. It's the edit, of course, that helps bring all of this together, and I think that's the other big tell that Dave is a lot more competent as a filmmaker than people would have you believe. These sequences are timed perfectly more often than not to master the awkward cut. Sometimes cuts happen too early, sometimes too late, but they're always done to maximise the comedic value of a scene, with Rick's first visit to his grandma's house being a near-perfect showcase of how to edit something to make it look weird and awkward. Most filmmakers aiming to do this badly would cut randomly and inconsistently. Sometimes it would work, sometimes it wouldn't, but the precision with which this edit works to maximise those cuts for the biggest laughs, I feel could only have been intentional. You can't fake comic pacing like that on a whim. There's talent behind it. Add to that the framing of the shots had to be kept in mind to allow the CG to be put in place, and I'm further convinced that this is purposeful over incompetence. Performance-wise, honestly, I think the guy in the Sasquatch costume is about as good as it gets. Bill Ushler as Rick is technically our main lead, and he can barely remember his lines, delivers them with the conviction of a DMV auditor, and barely has any on-screen physical presence. I feel kinda bad really, but he just did absolutely nothing for me here, with even his big action moments in the third act being kinda yawn-worthy. Sue Lynn Sanchez as Talia is probably one of the better performers in the film. Possible cultural appropriation aside, she at least remembers most of her lines and has a physicality during the action scenes that helps keep things lively. Her delivery of the lines is a bit questionable, but she tries to emote at least a bit, and there were at least a few instances where I didn't think she was terrible. But yeah, this isn't exactly a cast of Oscar nominees here. Dave Bonavita is a bit of a game of two halves, honestly. His line delivery and vocal performances are actually not too bad, but unfortunately, his physical acting, in my opinion at least, is appalling. I just really didn't get any kind of physicality from his performance, and the scenes where he's asked to be a bit more lively fall absolutely flat, which was a real shame. Probably the most entertaining aspect of all of this is the supporting cast, who all feel like friends and neighbours who've opted in on the premise of being in the movies, with which we see a performative range that swings from genuinely bewildering, such as Rick's grandma, through to the totally unremarkable, like the older couple who get mauled by Bigfoot at the end of the second act, They're bizarre and absolutely mesmerising to watch in the best possible way, and that kind of kept me hanging on just to see what on earth would be thrown at us next. And finally, the soundtrack, and its synth droning and what sounds like royalty-free action and percussion music. There isn't a lot of it, they repeat it a fair bit, and they have a lot of dead air through the runtime. But when it is used, I found it to be quite effective. I thought it was actually one of the better elements of this production, and I think it's handled quite well. Though, I will also say that because this film used the onboard camera mic, as with all films that use the onboard camera mic, audio quality is a bit all over the place. Sometimes it's overly quiet, sometimes it's way too loud, and none of it matches any of the quality of the ADR recordings. So everything sounds very patchwork and not particularly pleasant. Can't be helped on a low-budget shoot, but yeah, prepare your ears. Suburban Sasquatch was independently released in 2004 or 2005 on DVD by David's own label Troubled Moon Films, and slowly but surely jumped from label to label in sub-distribution for several years. I struggled to find all of them, but Red Letter Media has confirmed that it at least had a brief stint with Pendulum Films and another stint with Brain Damaged Films between 2004 and 2021. That was until 2022, when Visual Vengeance teamed up with David to bring the film to Blu-ray. Extras are pretty comprehensive, with a making of, trailers, an audio commentary with the filmmaker, and a complete Riff Tracks audio track for the movie. My copy came with a very nice slipcover, and as of the time of writing, it's still in print. So whether you want the authentic 2000s experience and to support the artist directly with the DVD version, link in the description below, or if you want to go bougie and buy the blue, there's something for everyone with this one. I'm probably alone with my thoughts and feelings on this movie, and I could totally understand the viewpoint that this is just a hilariously awful film made by a not very talented filmmaker. But it's all just too coincidental for me to not think that this is very carefully managed. Barring a few bits that just didn't quite gel with me, I really enjoyed Suburban Sasquatch. I'd recommend it as a starting point for folks who are looking to get into lo-fi, low-budget cinema, and if you've started to dip your toe into notorious films like The Room and are looking for a steer, I think this would be a natural progression point. I for one am keen to check out more of Dave's work as a result of seeing this one, and I hope you check it out as soon as you can.